The forest was everything they had imagined, serene, untouched, a true escape from the clamor of daily life. Ben took in a deep breath of the cool, pine-scented air, feeling the tension of the city melt away. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting golden hues across the campsite as the group set up their tents in the clearing. Maya laughed at some joke Sarah made, the sound blending with the rustling of leaves. It was perfect. As they built the fire, the sky gradually yapped on into a velvety twilight. Sparks from the crackling wood drifted upward, disappearing into the vastness above, while the shadows of the forest thickened, creeping closer with each passing minute. Their laughter seemed to float on the breeze, but something about the atmosphere felt off, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Maya was the first to notice. She wasn't sure if it was the way the firelight flickered or the strange chill in the air, but something was different. She glanced around, trying to shake the unease. The trees, towering and ancient, seemed to loom closer now, their silhouettes a little too still, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the camp. Ben, unaware of the growing tension, cracked open another beer and took a seat by the fire. This is exactly what we needed, huh? No phones, no noise, just us and the forest. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, as if the forest were mocking him. The wind picked up, a sudden gust that sent the flames sputtering and made the tents shudder. A cold draft settled over the group, making them huddle a little closer to the fire. That's when it started. The feeling that someone or something was watching them. It wasn't obvious at first. It came in brief moments, a flicker of movement at the edge of their vision, the rustling of leaves that seemed too deliberate. Each time one of them glanced into the darkness, there was nothing there. Only the forest, vast and indifferent. Sarah felt it next. Her eyes darted toward the trees, eyes, narrowing as if trying to catch the figure she swore had been there a second ago. She forced a smile, turning back to the group. Anyone else feel like this place gets a little creepy when the sun goes down? Ben waved it off with a laugh, but the fire crackled a little louder, sending another shiver through the circle. Night had fully descended now, and with it, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. The trees, once beautiful in the daylight, now loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets to the night. Maya's hand tightened around her jacket as she looked out at the forest. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of night, crickets, owls, the distant scurrying of small animals, were absent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft breath of wind. But in that silence, there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. She strained to hear, her heart beating a little faster, but as soon as she focused on it, it vanished, swallowed by the vast blackness around them. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ben looked at her, confused. "Hear what?" Maya hesitated, glancing around at the others. Sarah and the rest were too busy staring into the fire, but Maya's instincts screamed that something was wrong. "I don't know," she whispered, "but it's like something's out there." The air was cooler now, unnaturally cold for an autumn night, and the light from the fire seemed to dim slightly, as if the flames themselves were being swallowed by the dark. Even Ben, ever the skeptic, felt a ripple of unease as he glanced toward the trees. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt hostile, alive with something unseen and unknown. None of them dared say it out loud, but the feeling was undeniable. They were not alone. As the last light of day fully disappeared, the fire became their only source of warmth and security, its soft orange glow barely holding back the ever-encroaching blackness. The wind stirred again, but this time it carried something with it, faint, indistinct, like a distant voice lost in the trees. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. They wanted to believe it was just the wind. Maya sat closest to the fire, hugging her knees. She could feel it, the tension, the strange energy thickening the air. The forest felt different now, heavier, as though it had come alive and was breathing around them. It wasn't just her imagination. She could see it in the others too, in their stiff postures, the way they constantly glanced over their shoulders. The whispering sound returned, barely audible, but it was there, persistent, creeping into their minds like a slow, insidious poison. "Do you guys hear that?" Maya asked, her voice shaky. Ben, sitting across from her, paused mid-sip of his beer. He listened for a moment, his face stiffening as he heard it too, those whispers so faint they almost seemed imagined. He shook his head, trying to laugh it off. It's nothing, probably just the wind through the trees. But Maya knew better. This wasn't the wind, it was something else. The fire, once a source of comfort, now seemed frail, almost fragile against the weight of the darkness pressing in around them. The trees loomed closer, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long, crooked shadows that twisted like claws. Every now and then, a branch would snap somewhere deep in the forest, the sound sharp and unnatural, causing everyone to flinch. Then the whispers grew louder. It was subtle at first, barely more than a breath on the wind, but as the group sat in the deepening silence, the murmurs became more distinct, like voices just out of reach, conversing in a language no one could understand. Sarah froze, her eyes wide, staring into the dark void beyond the campfire. That's not the wind," she whispered. Her words sent a ripple of fear through the group. The tension, once easy to brush aside, now gnawed at their nerves, fraying the last threads of comfort they had left. The sound was everywhere now, surrounding them, circling the clearing like some unseen predator stalking its prey. Each whisper was a wordless beckoning, a call from the depths of the forest. Ben stood abruptly, grabbing the flashlight from his pack. "I'm gonna check it out," he said, his voice betraying his own uncertainty. Maya shot him a look. "Are you crazy? You're not going out there alone." "I'll just check the perimeter," Ben insisted, shining the beam into the darkness. The light cut through the trees, but revealed nothing beyond the twisting, shifting shadows. Still, the whispers persisted, growing bolder with each passing minute. As Ben took a few steps away from the fire, the others watched him intently, their faces pale in the dim glow. He pointed the flashlight into the woods, sweeping it back and forth, but all it illuminated were endless rows of trees, standing like silent sentinels. For a moment, the light caught something, a brief flash of movement deeper in the woods. Ben froze, squinting. It was too fast, too distant to make out, but something had definitely moved. He swallowed hard and took a step back toward the campfire. "I didn't see anything," he lied, his voice strained. But the others knew better. The whispering voices were louder now, undeniable, as if carried on the wind, but with a strange, unnatural cadence. It was as though the trees themselves were speaking in a tongue older than time, communicating with something buried deep within the forest. Maya felt it, a cold, creeping dread settling into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just watching them, it was waiting. "Let's just stay by the fire," Sarah suggested, her voice tight. "We'll be fine if we stick together." But as the night deepened, the forest grew more restless. The trees swayed, groaning like ancient beings shifting in their sleep, and the wind carried with it not just whispers, but faint, almost inaudible cries. The ground beneath them felt strange too, soft, like it could swallow them whole if they stayed too long. The fire sputtered again, and this time, it almost went out. For a brief moment, the clearing was plunged into near total darkness, and in that instant, they all felt it, the presence. It was no longer subtle, no longer a distant threat. It was here in the forest just beyond the glow of their dying fire. Ben clutched the flashlight tightly, his breath quickening. He swept the beam across the trees again, this time slower, more deliberate. And that's when they saw it, a shadow, barely visible, standing between the trees. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was real. The figure stood motionless, watching them. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might draw it closer. No one moved. No one breathed. The figure didn't move either, but its presence weighed on them like a crushing force. Then slowly it faded back into the shadows, as if melting into the forest itself. The whispers continued, now more like a chorus, surrounding them from all sides. The air grew colder, and the fire once again flickered weakly, as though the darkness was trying to snuff it out. The group huddled closer together, their backs to the fire, eyes fixed on the woods, dreading what might come next. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. The tension had become unbearable, a palpable weight pressing down on the group as the fire flickered weakly in the growing darkness. Their breath hung in the air, the temperature dropping far lower than it should have on an autumn night. Maya's hands trembled as she huddled closer to the fire, trying to soak up what little warmth remained. But it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the presence, the whispers, the shadows, the sense of being watched. It was all too real now. They weren't alone. Ben's flashlight flickered, the beam weak as it swept across the forest again. But this time, they didn't need the light to see what was lurking just beyond the campfire's glow. Slowly, as if emerging from the trees themselves, figures began to appear. At first, they were nothing more than shapes, vague, almost formless shadows that seemed to shift with the wind. But as the moments dragged on, those shapes took form. Pale faces began to emerge from the darkness, their features barely distinguishable in the dim light. The air grew colder still, and with every passing second, the figures became clearer. They were human, or at least they had been once. The group sat frozen in terror as they watched the specters come into focus. Men and women, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into expressions of pain, despair, and anguish. They stood just outside the fire's reach, as though bound by some invisible force that kept them from stepping into the light. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are they?" No one had an answer. The apparitions didn't move. They simply stood there, watching, their eyes empty and cold. Their clothes were tattered, worn with the passage of time, and their skin, if it could still be called that, was pale and translucent, like the fog that clung to the ground. There was something tragically familiar about them, as though these were not just random spirits, but people who had once been part of this world, people who had been lost to the forest. Maya's eyes locked on one of the figures, her heart racing. It was a woman standing at the edge of the clearing, her long, tangled hair draped over her face. Something about her seemed recognizable. Maya squinted, her breath catching in her throat as a memory clawed its way to the surface. She had seen this woman before. Years ago in an old news article, the woman had gone missing in this very forest, along with others. Search parties had been sent out, but they had never found her. No one ever found any of them. Now she stood before Maya, her empty eyes fixed on her as if pleading for help. But there was something else, something darker beneath that gaze. A warning, perhaps, or maybe even a threat. Maya opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat as the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. The voices weren't just coming from the wind anymore. They were coming from the ghosts. Their mouths moved, forming words, though the sounds were distant, distorted, as though they were being spoken from some other realm. The others began to notice the same thing. Each of them was seeing a different ghost, but there was something personal about these apparitions, something that made the terror cut deeper. Ben's face paled as he stared at a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, but Ben recognized him instantly. His breath caught in his chest. This was his older brother, Jason, disappeared nearly a decade ago. Jason had gone hiking in the mountains, never to return. Ben had been too young to join him on that trip, and he had lived with the guilt ever since. But now here he was, standing in the shadows of the forest, his eyes filled with the same emptiness as the others. "Jason," Ben whispered, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond, only stared back, his expression unreadable. But the whispers grew louder in Ben's mind, swirling around him like a storm. Words formed, half-formed sentences, a message he couldn't quite grasp but felt deep in his bones. His brother wasn't here to comfort him. He was here to warn him. Sarah, meanwhile, was staring at something else, a small, fragile form standing near the base of a tree. Her stomach turned, a sick feeling rising in her chest as she recognized the figure of a child. The boy's face was pale, his eyes weighed and dark, and Sarah couldn't look away. She had always avoided thinking about it, but now the memory rushed back. The miscarriage, the child she had never met, the life that had been taken too soon. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached out instinctively, her hand trembling. But the child faded before her hand could touch him, leaving only the empty darkness behind. The forest seemed to pulse with life now, an ancient, malevolent energy that seeped into their bones. The ghosts were not there to comfort them or offer closure. They were trapped, bound to this cursed place, their souls forever wandering. Each step the group took into this forest had drawn them deeper into its web, and now they were caught, just like the lost souls who had come before them. The whispers had grown louder still, and though none of the group could understand the exact words, the message was clear: leave, or become one of us. Maya's heart raced as she looked around at her friends, the terror in their eyes mirroring her own. They couldn't stay here. Whatever was happening, whatever the forest wanted from them, they had to escape. But even as that thought solidified in her mind, a new horror dawned on her. The ghosts weren't the only ones watching them. Behind the apparitions, deeper in the forest, something else moved. It was different, darker, more solid. It wasn't a ghost, it was something else, something far more dangerous. The forest was warning them, but it was also keeping them here, trapped with something far worse. The fire crackled weakly, its light casting flickering shadows over the terrified faces of the group. They were paralyzed by fear, staring into the dark forest where the ghosts of the lost still lingered, their whispers echoing through the clearing like an ancient chant. But now, beyond the ghosts, something far more sinister was stirring. It moved slowly at first, barely noticeable, as if it were part of the forest itself. The trees seemed to shift, the shadows deepening unnaturally, as though the very fabric of the night was warping to allow something ancient and monstrous to step through. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she squinted into the darkness, her body tensing. The apparitions of the lost souls stood still, their eyes vacant, but behind them a new presence emerged. It was not a ghost, nor was it human. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the air, deep, resonant, and unmistakably alive. The shadows twisted, and then slowly a shape took form. At first it was difficult to make out, its body blending with the darkness, but soon the outlines became clear. Long, thin limbs, unnaturally tall, towering over the trees. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the terror it was invoking. The thing's skin, if it could be called skin, was blacker than the night itself, absorbing all light around it. In its face, or what passed for a face, was a grotesque, twisted mask of hollow, empty sockets and gaping, jagged teeth. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fire. What is that? Ben couldn't answer. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he pointed it toward the creature, but the light barely penetrated the darkness surrounding it. The thing seemed to bend the shadows around itself, like a living void, and every step it took toward them was accompanied by that low, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated through the ground and up into their bones. Maya's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. The ghost had been terrifying enough, but this was something far worse. The lost souls of the forest had tried to warn them. They had shown themselves not out of malice, but as a desperate attempt to push the living away from this place before it was too late. But now too late was exactly what it was. The creature moved closer, its enormous, spindly arms stretching toward the clearing, its claw-like fingers scraping against the trees. The ghosts, once standing eerily still, began to retreat, their figures dissolving into the shadows as if they feared this thing as much as the living did. Whatever it wasn't just a predator. It was the forest's darkest secret and something ancient and malevolent, drawn to the fear and life of those who ventured too deep. Maya's voice shook as she whispered, "We have to go, now." But even as she spoke, the creature stopped, its head tilting unnaturally, almost as if it had heard her. A horrible clicking sound came from its mouth, or perhaps from its chest, where its ribs seemed to shift and expand as though something was crawling beneath its skin. Its eyeless face locked onto the group, and suddenly it let out a piercing, inhuman scream that split the night, sending a shockwave through the clearing. Ben dropped the flashlight, and the fire sputtered dangerously low, as if the very presence of the creature was choking the life out of everything around it. "Run!" Ben shouted, his voice hoarse with terror. They didn't need to be told twice. Sarah was the first to bolt, scrambling over the rocks and roots as she fled into the forest. Maya and Ben followed, their feet slipping on the soft earth as they ran deeper into the woods, away from the clearing, away from the thing that had emerged from the darkness. The forest closed in around them as they ran, the trees becoming denser, the undergrowth thicker. The creature's horrible scream echoed behind them, a sound so unnatural it seemed to shake the very ground. But worse than the scream was the way the forest itself seemed to conspire against them. Branches clawed at their clothes, roots appeared out of nowhere, tripping them up as they fled blindly through the dark. Maya's lungs burned, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear Sarah's labored breathing just ahead of her and Ben's heavy footsteps behind. But the sense of being hunted was overwhelming. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't chasing them out of the forest. It was driving them deeper in, pushing them towards something. Maya stumbled, nearly falling face first into the dirt, but Ben caught her arm and yanked her back to her feet. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice panicked. "We have to get out of here." But where was out? The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching in all directions, their twisted forms indistinguishable from one another. Maya could barely see through the darkness, and the whispers had returned, louder now, more urgent. The ghosts were still there, their voices merging with the wind, but they offered no comfort, only warnings, too late to be of any use. Sarah screamed up ahead, and Maya's heart lurched. She couldn't see her, but the scream was filled with pure terror. Maya pushed herself harder, sprinting through the dense undergrowth, but when she broke through the trees into a small clearing, she stopped dead. Sarah stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with horror, her face pale as a sheet. She was staring at something on the ground. Maya followed her gaze, and her blood turned to ice. There, lying in the dirt, were bones, old, weathered bones scattered across the ground like the remnants of some ancient feast. But it wasn't just the bones that terrified her. It was the fact that they were everywhere, strewn around the clearing like offerings to some dark, forgotten deity. And standing at the far edge of the clearing, towering over them, was the creature. Its massive form seemed even larger now, its limbs twisted and grotesque as it crouched low, watching them, waiting. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The ghosts, the lost souls of the forest, were warning them again, but this time it wasn't to run. This time the warning was simple, chilling. No one leaves. The clearing was silent, save for the sound of their panicked breathing. The creature stood motionless at the edge, a towering nightmare of limbs and shadow. Its hollow, eyeless face was fixed on them, its long arms swaying slightly as though it was waiting for them to make a move, waiting for the fear to fully take hold. The scattered bones at their feet told the story of what had happened to those who had come before. Each one had been drawn into this cursed forest. Each had run just as they were now running, and each had been claimed. The realization hit Maya like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. The forest wasn't a mere setting. It was alive, sentient, and hungry. It had lured them in, using the ghosts of the past as bait, and now it was preparing to devour them, body and soul. "Ben!" Maya's voice was barely a whisper, her throat dry, but her friend didn't respond. He was staring at the creature, his eyes wide with disbelief, his mind seemingly trapped in the horror of what he was seeing. Sarah was on the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably as she knelt among the bones, tears streaming down her face. It was as if the weight of the truth had crushed her, drained her of the will to move. Maya tried to move towards Sarah, to pull her away, but her legs felt heavy, her body weak. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, as if the forest had turned it into a living thing, pressing down on them, trapping them. Every step was a struggle. It was as though the forest had finally closed its jaws around them, and now there was no way out. The creature took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost calculated. It knew there was no need to rush. The terror in the air was palpable, and it was feeding off it, growing stronger with every passing second. The shadows twisted and writhed around it, almost like they were alive, reaching out toward the group. Maya's mind raced, her breath shallow. They couldn't just stand there and wait to die. There had to be some way out, some last chance. The whispers, those cursed whispers, still surrounded them, growing louder and louder, as if the forest itself was screaming now. The ghosts were still there, hovering at the edges of her vision, their faces pale, mouths open in silent screams of warning. And then, as the creature stepped closer, it hit her. The warnings, the lost souls, the bones littering the forest floor. And all of it was connected. The people who had disappeared, the stories of the cursed forest. They hadn't simply been killed by the creature. They had become part of it. Maya's stubborn, Maya's stomach turned as she understood. The forest wasn't just killing people, it was consuming them, absorbing their souls into itself. Each victim became part of the forest's curse, bound to the trees, doomed to wander forever, their whispers calling out to warn those who might follow. The ghosts weren't trying to scare them, they were trying to save them from a fate worse than death. But it was too late for that now. The creature was almost upon them. Ben finally snapped out of his stupor, grabbing Maya's arm and yanking her back away from the thing's grasp. "We have to run," he shouted, though there was a note of despair in his voice. He knew, just as Maya did, that running was futile. Sarah stumbled to her feet, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes were distant, hollow. She hadn't processed the horror yet, or maybe she had given up entirely. Still she moved, following Ben and Maya as they turned and fled once again, crashing through the trees in a last desperate attempt to escape. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran, the branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The creature's steps were heavy behind them, slow but unrelenting. It didn't need to hurry. It knew they had nowhere to go. The whispers reached a fever pitch, surrounding them from every direction, overlapping as though the lost souls were trying to communicate one last desperate message. Maya's legs burned, her lungs screaming for air, but she pushed on, driven by sheer terror. Ahead of her, she could hear Ben cursing, his voice tight with panic, and Sarah's sobs growing more frantic. The trees were growing denser, the shadows deeper, until it was nearly impossible to see. The ground beneath them seemed to shift and move, as though it too was alive, pulling them down, dragging them deeper into the forest maw. And then they broke through the trees and stumbled into another clearing. But this one was different. It was vast, more open than the others, and at its center stood something that froze them all in place, an ancient, gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching up toward the night sky like skeletal fingers. The tree was enormous, its bark blackened and cracked, its roots snaking through the ground like veins. And hanging from its branches were remnants of the past, torn pieces of clothing, rusted jewelry, objects that had once belonged to the forest victims. It was a shrine, a monument to the dead. Ben fell to his knees, gasping for breath, and Maya followed suit, her body trembling uncontrollably. Sarah stood, staring blankly at the tree, her face drained of all color. The whispers surrounded them now, louder than ever, rising to a deafening crescendo as the creature stepped into the clearing behind them. The tree bit a tire true. It was the heart of the forest, the source of the curse. The creature moved toward the tree, its long clawed fingers brushing against the bark, and for a moment, everything became eerily still. The whispers ceased, the wind died down, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Maya's mind raced, searching for some last-ditch effort to stop this, to escape. But she knew. Deep down, she knew. This was the end. The creature's hollow face turned toward them one last time, its mouth opening in a grotesque grin, and then it lunged. The clearing was filled with the sound of screams, of tearing flesh, of bone snapping under immense pressure. But soon even the screams were swallowed by the darkness, absorbed by the forest as it claimed its latest victims. The whispers returned, softer now, as though the forest had been momentarily sated. The clearing fell silent once more, the ancient tree standing as a sentinel over the souls that would forever wander its depths. And the wind carried the voices of the newly lost, their warnings joining those of the others. No one leaves. The five friends arrived at the edge of the wilderness just as the sun began to dip below the tree line. The long drive had been worth it. The forest spread out before them, vast and untouched, with ancient trees standing sentinel over the land like silent giants. The air was crisp, clean, carrying the sweet scent of pine and earth. It was everything they had hoped for, isolated, tranquil, the perfect escape from their daily grind. Sarah, ever the organizer, took charge of setting up camp. Her boyfriend James dutifully followed her lead, hauling gear and driving stakes into the soft forest floor. Daniel, always the comedian, complained loudly but followed suit, making light of the work with exaggerated grunts and comments about nature not being for him. Olivia and Emma gathered kindling for the fire, chatting animatedly about how refreshing it was to disconnect from the world. As they worked, they shared stories, laughed, and breathed in the serene beauty of their surroundings. The tension of everyday life, the deadlines, the stress, the city felt miles away, and for the first time in a long while they relaxed. The sounds of the forest were alive with life, birds calling from the canopy, the rustling of leaves, the distant trickle of a nearby stream. The campsite itself seemed perfect, a wide open space surrounded by trees, with the last rays of sunlight filtering through the branches, casting everything in a warm golden glow. Sarah smiled to herself. It was going to be a great weekend, she thought, a chance to reset, to recharge, to be with the people she cared about. As night began to fall, the group gathered around the fire, its flames casting flickering shadows that danced across their faces. The darkness crept in slowly, enveloping the forest in a thick, almost oppressive silence. But around the fire, the friends still felt safe, cocooned in their own little world. They talked about old memories, shared jokes, and passed around beers, the warmth of the flames and the crackle of the wood lulling them into a sense of comfort. Yet, there was an undercurrent, a subtle unease that they were all too happy to ignore. When Olivia pointed out how quickly the temperature had dropped, everyone just brushed it off. "We're in the mountains. It's supposed to get cold," Daniel had said, though even he pulled his jacket a little tighter around his shoulders. There was a certain weight in the air, a heaviness, but it was easy to ignore when surrounded by laughter and light. As they settled in for the night, the sounds of the forest seemed to change. The usual hum of nocturnal creatures was absent. No owls, no insects, just a strange, oppressive silence that pressed against the boundaries of the camp. But no one mentioned it. Instead, they clung to the fire and each other, dismissing the growing feeling of unease as simple imagination. The night deepened. The fire crackled softly, sending embers into the sky. But as the darkness thickened, the woods seemed to creep closer. A cold breeze swept through the camp, sudden and biting, causing the flames to flicker and dim. Sarah shivered and wrapped her arms around her waist. "It wasn't this cold before, was it?" she asked, her breath visible in the air. James shook his head but said nothing, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees for always beyond their campsite. That was when the first sound came, a distant, rhythmic thumping, almost like the beat of a drum, deep within the woods. It was faint, barely noticeable, but Olivia heard it and turned her head sharply, eyes wide. "Did anyone else hear that?" "No, it's nothing," Daniel said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. "Probably just the wind knocking something over. Relax." But as they all grew quiet, straining to listen, the sound was undeniable. A slow, steady pulse, far away but growing closer, reverberating through the trees like a heartbeat. The laughter and camaraderie from earlier began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The forest, once so inviting, now seemed darker, deeper, its shadows stretching out toward them like long fingers. They tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves that everything was fine. But as the night wore on, the cold intensified, seeping into their bones, and the strange thumping continued. Relentless, growing just a little louder, just a little closer. The night wore on, and with it, the forest facade of serenity began to crack. The temperature plummeted even further, the chill settling deep into their bones despite their attempts to stay warm by the fire. As they huddled close together, each friend felt an inexplicable weight pressing down on them, a thick silence that seemed to swallow their laughter whole. "Maybe we should get some more firewood," Sarah suggested, attempting to break the growing tension. Daniel volunteered, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. "I'll go check out the area behind the camp. There's bound to be some dead branches nearby." "No, Daniel, stay close," James cautioned, glancing nervously at the dark woods that loomed just beyond the campfire's reach. But Daniel, always the rebel, waved off the concern. "I'll be right back. I'm not scared of a few trees." With that, he ventured into the shadows, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness. The remaining friends fell silent, watching the flickering firelight dance against the trees, straining to hear anything from the woods. A minute passed, then two. A sense of foreboding filled the air, thickening with each passing moment. The rhythmic drumming from earlier had faded, but now a low rustling echoed from the direction Daniel had gone, sharp and unsettling. "Maybe we should call for him?" Olivia suggested, her voice trembling slightly. But before anyone could answer, a scream shattered the night. a raw, primal scream that pierced the stillness and froze the blood in their veins. "Daniel!" James shouted, his heart racing. He leapt to his feet and ran toward the darkness, but Sarah grasped his arm tightly. "Wait, we can't just run off. What if something's out there?" The air thickened with panic as they all realized the gravity of the situation. They could hear footsteps now, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. James's breath quickened as he pulled away from Sarah, his eyes wide. "We have to find him. He could be hurt." Before Sarah could object, he bolted into the trees, vanishing into the dark. Alone with Olivia, the forest felt suddenly smaller, as if the shadows were pressing in, waiting to consume them. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, and Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Maybe we should just stay here," Olivia whispered, her voice quavering. "He'll come back, right?" But even as she spoke, her eyes darted nervously toward the tree line, searching for any sign of Daniel or James. A cold wind swept through the camp, wrapping around them like icy fingers. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, teasing the edges of their sanity. Then came the whispering, soft and low, like a hiss carried by the breeze. Sarah's skin prickled as the words slipped through the trees, unintelligible but filled with malice. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. Olivia nodded, fear pooling in her eyes. "It sounds like it's coming from everywhere." Suddenly, without warning, a figure emerged from the darkness. James, his face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but he was alone. "Where's Daniel?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I don't know. I couldn't find him," James replied, his breath ragged. "But I heard something out there." Panic surged as they turned their attention back to the forest. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them, growing more insistent. "We need to go back to the car," Olivia urged, her voice rising in urgency. But before they could move, a low growl echoed from the depths of the woods, sending chills down their spines. The shadows seemed to shift, elongating, twisting into grotesque forms that danced at the edges of the firelight. "Stay close," James ordered, pulling Sarah and Olivia closer. But the forest had other plans. From the darkness, a rustle drew their attention, and they all turned, their hearts racing as the underbrush stirred. "Daniel," Sarah called out, her voice shaking. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and suddenly from the shadows, a dark figure rushed toward them. Daniel, or at least, what was left of him. His clothes were torn, his eyes wide with a primal terror that had sent a wave of dread washing over the group. He stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, but as he opened his mouth to speak, a horrid, distorted sound erupted from his throat, a scream mixed with an otherworldly growl. He collapsed to the ground, shaking, and the whispers intensified, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. Sarah and Olivia backed away, their hearts racing as Daniel clawed at the ground, his eyes darting wildly as if something unseen was attacking him. "Run! We need to get out of here!" James yelled, but the forest seemed to come alive around them, branches snapping and leaves rustling as the shadows closed in. The weight of the darkness pressed down, a suffocating blanket that smothered their cries for help. With their minds racing, Sarah took Daniel's arm, trying to pull him to his feet, but he was lost in a panic, fighting against something only he could see. The whispers morphed into screams, anguished voices calling from the trees, dragging them down into despair. As the forest enveloped them, they realized too late that they were not just lost in the woods. They were trapped in the grip of something ancient and malevolent, a darkness that had waited for centuries to awaken. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, the very essence of fear wrapped around them like a noose, squeezing tighter as they struggled against the encroaching shadows, unsure of what was real and what was mere illusion. Panic surged through the group as the forest descended into chaos. Sarah struggled to keep a grip on Daniel, who writhed on the ground, his eyes widened and unseeing, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. The whispers morphed into a cacophony of terrified voices, swirling around them, echoing through the trees and bouncing off the stones. "Get up, Daniel, we need to move," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with fear as she pulled him. James stepped forward, eyes darting wildly, desperately searching for a way out. "We can't stay here. We have to find the others." But the forest seemed to pulse with life, the trees shifting as if they were alive, closing in on them, twisting into grotesque shapes. The shadows danced, flickering at the edge of their vision, and every time they turned, they felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them from the darkness. "Where's Olivia?" James asked, fear gripping his throat. Sarah glanced around, panic blooming in her chest. "I don't know. She was right here." As if on cue, a shrill scream pierced the night, echoing through the trees. It was Olivia, her voice filled with terror, carried on the wind. Without thinking, James dashed into the shadows, leaving Sarah clutching Daniel, who continued to thrash on the ground, lost in his own torment. "Stay here," she shouted, but James was already gone, swallowed by the dark. Alone with Daniel, the forest felt increasingly oppressive. The air grew thick, suffocating as the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. "Sarah, help!" Daniel gasped, his eyes rolling back as if he were fighting against something unseen. "They're coming! We have to!" His words were cut off by a violent tremor that shook his body, and Sarah watched, horrified, as shadows seemed to creep closer, hungry and insatiable. Suddenly, a figure darted out of the trees, James, stumbling backward, his face ashen. "It's not safe. We have to go." He reached for Sarah, but a heavy thud reverberated through the ground, silencing everything. They turned in unison to face the source of the sound. A low growl emanated from the darkness, deep and resonant, echoing like thunder through the night. A shape emerged, taller than any of them, its form obscured by shadows, its eyes glowing like coals in the dark. It was a creature of nightmare, an ancient embodiment of the forest's darkest secrets, moving with a predatory grace. "Run!" James shouted, pulling Sarah to her feet. But Daniel, still in the throes of terror, grasped her ankle with a grip of iron. "No, don't leave me! Don't go!" Panic surged within her, and with a surge of adrenaline, Sarah wrenched her leg free. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she cried, but there was no time for remorse. She and James stumbled backward, the creature advancing, its growl growing louder, a deep rumble that resonated in their bones. As they fled deeper into the woods, branches clawed at them, and the darkness seemed to shift and pulse, guiding their path in twisted ways. They could hear Daniel's desperate screams fading behind them, merging with the whispers of the forest. "We can't leave him," James gasped, glancing back, but the shadows swallowed Daniel's cries, muffling them into silence. "Just keep running," Sarah urged, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to find Olivia." But as they sprinted through the underbrush, the shadows seemed to twist and turn around them, disorienting them, leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. Every snap of a twig sent adrenaline coursing through their veins, and the whispers followed them like a sinister chant. "Help!" a voice cried, and they both froze. It was Olivia, sounding close but distorted and echoing as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help me, I can't—" "Olivia!" Sarah called, desperation flooding her voice. "Where are you?" But the voice faded, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. James grabbed Sarah's arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to keep moving. It's playing with us." The shadows thickened, wrapping around them like a shroud, and the growl of the creature resonated through the trees, a constant reminder of their peril. They ran until their lungs burned, the forest closing in, branches snagging at their clothes as if trying to pull them back. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing, panting, the moonlight filtering down through the canopy above. It felt eerily still here, but there was no sign of Olivia. "Where is she?" Sarah gasped, her heart racing. "I don't know," James replied, scanning the dark edges of the clearing. "But we need to find her. We can't leave her behind." But just as he spoke, a chilling silence enveloped them. The growling stopped, and the whispers faded into an unnatural quiet. An icy wind swept through the clearing, making the hairs on their arms stand on end. Then, without warning, a dark figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. It was tall and emaciated, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. It held a grotesque smile, stretching impossibly wide across its face. "Did you lose something?" it hissed, the voice echoing in their minds, chilling them to the bone. Before they could react, the shadows lunged forward, engulfing James in darkness. Sarah screamed, reaching for him, but he vanished into the void, leaving her alone in the clearing. Panic gripped her heart as the darkness twisted around her, the whispers growing louder, each word a taunt, each shadow a reminder of what she had lost. She turned to run, but the shadows coiled around her legs, dragging her down, pulling her toward the heart of the forest where only nightmares dwelled. Sarah felt her sanity fraying at the edges as the realization dawned on her. This place was alive, and it thrived on fear. The forest had claimed her friends, and it would not let her escape. Sarah fought against the grip of the shadows, her heart racing as they coiled tighter around her legs, dragging her down into the cold earth. Panic surged through her, and she could feel the whispers intensifying, echoing in her mind like a twisted lullaby. "James, Daniel, Olivia!" she screamed, her voice breaking. But the forest swallowed her cries and the oppressive silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the frantic beating of her heart, drowning out the whispers that beckoned her deeper into the darkness. With every ounce of strength, she forced herself to stand, breaking free from the shadow's hold. She stumbled into the clearing, breathless and terrified, her mind racing. She had to find her friends. They couldn't be gone. They were out there somewhere, trapped just as she was, caught in the clutches of whatever ancient evil lurked in this forest. Desperation fueled her, and she dashed into the depths of the woods, the twisted trees looming above her like silent sentinels. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, sending chills down her spine, and the darkness felt alive, pulsating with malevolence. "Help!" she called out, her voice hoarse. "James! Olivia!" But all she received was the echo of her own cries, swallowed by the shadows. The whispers began again, rising and falling like the tide, taunting her. "Join us. Join us." They slithered into her thoughts, eroding her resolve. She pressed on, determined to escape the clutches of the darkness, but the forest seemed to shift around her, branches grasping at her clothes, tugging her back. Just as despair threatened to overtake her, she stumbled into a small, overgrown clearing, the moonlight spilling through the treetops like silver threads. In the center lay a circle of stones, ancient and weathered, each etched with strange symbols that pulsed with a faint light. The sight sent a shiver of recognition through her, a warning, an ancient relic of whatever evil dwelled here. This must be the source of the malevolent presence, she thought. The shadows hung heavily around the stones, and she could feel a powerful energy emanating from them, dark and corrupt. As she approached, she heard another scream, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the trees. "Olivia!" Sarah gasped, her heart racing. Without thinking, she rushed toward the sound, navigating the twisted underbrush. She burst through the trees into another clearing, and there she saw her, Olivia backed against a gnarled tree, eyes wide with terror. Shadows danced around her, clawing at her, pulling her toward the darkness. "Sarah!" Olivia cried, desperation etched across her face. "Help me!" Without hesitation, Sarah lunged forward, reaching for Olivia's hand. "Hold on, I'll pull you out." But as her fingers closed around Olivia's wrist, a powerful force surged from the ground, sending shockwaves through the air. The shadows writhed, and with a terrifying roar they lashed out, trying to separate them. "Let go! I can't hold on!" Olivia screamed, panic flooding her voice. "I won't let you go!" Sarah shouted back, bracing herself against the pull of the shadows. The ground beneath them trembled as the whispers swelled, a cacophony of voices pleading, threatening, begging to be released. In that moment, Sarah felt the weight of their friendship, the bond that held them together even in the face of unspeakable horror. Summoning every ounce of strength, she dug her heels into the ground and pulled with all her might. As Olivia stumbled forward, the shadows screamed in rage, a chorus of lost souls wailing, trying to reclaim their victim. But Sarah's determination pushed her through the pain, and with a final surge, they broke free from the grasp of the darkness. Gasping for breath, they stumbled back into the moonlight, but relief was short-lived. From the depths of the forest, the towering figure of the ancient spirit materialized, emerging from the shadows with a malevolent presence. Its eyes glowed like embers, fixed on the two friends, and its grotesque smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice echoing in their minds. "You belong to the forest now." "Run!" Sarah yelled, her heart pounding. They turned and fled, racing through the trees as the spirit's laughter echoed behind them, a haunting melody that sent shivers down their spines. The forest seemed to close in around them, branches scratching at their faces, roots tangling around their feet, trying to trip them up. As they ran, the ground beneath them began to shift and pulse, as if the very earth was alive. conspiring against them. The air grew colder, filled with the scent of decay and despair, and the whispers transformed into screams, anguished cries that clawed at their sanity. "Where's James?" Olivia gasped, glancing back as they ran. "He was right behind us." "I don't know. We have to keep moving," Sarah urged, dread pooling in her stomach. But as they sprinted deeper into the forest, it felt as if the shadows were closing in, suffocating them, dragging them toward an inescapable fate. Suddenly, they stumbled into another clearing, this one even larger, the moonlight illuminating the ancient stones arranged in a circle. It was eerily quiet here, the whispers fading, replaced by an ominous stillness. "What is this place?" Olivia murmured, awe mingling with fear. Before Sarah could respond, the ground began to tremble violently beneath their feet. The stones glowed brighter, pulsating with dark energy as the spirit manifested within the circle, its form shifting and twisting, revealing glimpses of the tortured souls trapped within. "You cannot escape," it roared, the air vibrating with its power. "This forest is alive, and you will feed it." Panic surged through Sarah as she grasped Olivia's hand tightly. "We need to find James," she shouted, but the shadows erupted around them, swallowing their cries and dragging them toward the circle. As the spirit lunged forward, they realized there was no choice left. They had to confront the darkness, to face the terror that had consumed their friends. "Together!" Sarah yelled, determination flooding her veins. They stepped forward, breaking through the shadows, ready to face the malevolent force that sought to claim them. They had come seeking adventure, but they would leave as warriors, fighting against an ancient evil that thrived on fear and despair, determined to reclaim their freedom or die trying. The air crackled with tension as Sarah and Olivia stood firm, their hands clasped tightly together. The oppressive weight of the spirit's malevolence loomed over them, a palpable force threatening to consume their very souls. The ancient spirit, with its gnarled form and glowing eyes, towered in the center of the stone circle, its laughter echoing ominously through the clearing. "You think you can resist?" it taunted, its voice a chorus of tortured souls. "This place is a prison for the lost, and you will join them." "No!" Sarah shouted, her voice ringing with defiance. "We won't let you take us." As the spirit lunged forward, shadows spiraled around them, seeking to pull them into the depths of despair. But Sarah remembered the connection she felt with her friends, the bond that had held them together even in their darkest moments. She focused on that connection, channeling it into her voice. "James, Daniel, we're here," she called out, her voice rising above the chaos. "We're fighting for you. You're not lost." As if responding to her call on us, a flicker of light emerged from the shadows. From the depths of the darkness, James stumbled into the clearing, his face pale and haunted. "Sarah, Olivia," he gasped, relief flooding his features, but fear quickly followed as he spotted the spirit. "Stay back," Sarah warned, her heart racing. "We need to stand together." The spirit hissed, its eyes narrowing. "You think strength in numbers can save you? You're too late. The forest hungers." But Sarah, feeling the pulsing energy of the stones beneath her feet, realized they were not powerless. "The stones, they're connected to the spirit," she shouted, glancing at her friends. "We have to break the bond." As they formed a circle around the stones, the air thickened with a dark energy, and the spirit screeched, thrashing as if in pain. "You dare defy me?" it roared, the shadows swirling violently around them. But they held their ground, united in their resolve. Together, they began to chant, their voices rising in unison, a mantra of defiance against the ancient evil. "We are not afraid, we are not lost." The words echoed through the clearing, resonating with the power of their shared friendship and love. The energy from the stones flared, illuminating the darkness, pushing back against the spirit. "No!" it howled, its form wavering, flickering like a candle in the wind. "You cannot break the bond." But Sarah felt the strength of her friends surging through her, amplifying her courage. "We're breaking the bond," she shouted, and as the last word left her lips, a shockwave erupted from the stones, sending a blast of light coursing through the clearing. The spirit roared in fury, its form disintegrating, shadows swirling in a frenzy. "You will pay for this. You cannot escape the darkness." As the light engulfed them, Sarah felt a surge of hope, warmth spreading through her body. "Together," she cried, and they clasped hands tighter, standing firm against the chaos. In that moment, the shadows recoiled, the spirit's form collapsing into itself, imploding in a blinding flash of light. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence as the dark energy shattered, sending ripples through the air. As the light faded, they found themselves standing alone in the clearing, breathless and shaken. The stone circle lay untouched, the symbols no longer glowing, as if the ancient evil had been banished. "Is it over?" Olivia whispered, glancing around nervously. "I think so," James replied, his voice shaky. "But we need to get out of here, now." As they turned to leave, a rustling in the bushes caught their attention. They froze, hearts racing, but from the darkness emerged Daniel, weary and battered but alive. "You made it," he gasped, relief flooding his features. "Daniel," Sarah cried, rushing forward to embrace him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We thought we lost you." "I thought I was done for," he admitted, shaking but smiling. "But I heard you fighting. I knew you wouldn't give up." The four friends stood together, the warmth of their reunion washing over them like a balm, dispelling the remnants of fear that lingered in the shadows. "Let's get out of this cursed place," Olivia urged, glancing nervously toward the trees that seemed to watch them. As they made their way back through the woods, the path felt clearer, the darkness no longer pressing in around them. The whispers had faded, replaced by the sound of leaves rustling gently in the breeze, as if the forest itself had exhaled in relief. Once they reached their car, the weight of the night began to lift. They climbed inside, heartbeats still racing, and Daniel started the engine, the sound of the motor cutting through the silence like a promise of safety. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the forest, a mix of emotions swirling within her. They had faced unimaginable terror, but they had also discovered the strength of their friendship and the resilience of their spirits. They had broken the bond of darkness, and for that, they were from. Yet, as they traveled down the winding road, a lingering thought tugged at her mind. The forest was ancient, its secrets deep, and it would not forget. And as they left, far in the depths of the trees, the shadows shifted inside, biding their time, waiting for the next unwary souls to wander into their grasp. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow across the landscape as the Johnson family set off on their much-anticipated journey to visit friends. Mark, behind the wheel, reveled in the warmth of his wife, Lisa, beside him, while Mia and Jake filled the backseat with excited chatter. The joy of the trip enveloped them, the car filled with laughter, snacks, and the rhythmic music of their favorite playlist. However, the winding road soon led them into a denser part of the woods, where towering trees encroached on the narrow path. Their laughter faded into nervous giggles, the towering pines leaning over them like ancient guardians. The vibrant fall foliage surrounded them, brilliant reds and oranges contrasting sharply with the deep greens of the ever-present underbrush. It was picturesque and inviting, yet there was an undercurrent of something unsettling, a sense that they were being watched. The moment came suddenly, a thud that reverberated through the car, and the vehicle shuddered violently. Mark pulled over, his heart racing as he shifted gears. "Flat tire," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He forced a smile for his family, but felt a tightening in his chest. Stepping out into the brisk evening air, he surveyed the surroundings. The woods felt thick, alive with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He opened the trunk to retrieve the spare tire, the metallic clang of tools echoing into the forest depths. The chirping of crickets replaced the sounds of laughter, and the shadows lengthened ominously as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Do you have a signal?" Lisa asked, glancing at her phone. Mark shook his head, glancing at the small screen displaying no service in an increasingly remote area of the woods. He turned back to his family, masking his concern with a forced cheerfulness. "Let's set up camp while I fix this. We'll be on our way in no time." Setting up beside the car, the air turned cooler as darkness began to seep into the forest. They spread blankets over the ground and lit a small fire, its flames flickering against the encroaching shadows. The warmth was comforting, yet the flickering light felt feeble against the growing darkness that loomed around them. Lisa tried to keep the mood light, sharing stories and jokes, but each punchline fell flat in the thickening air. The kids, sensing their parents' unease, glanced warily at the trees that loomed like silent spectators. Mia, always perceptive, whispered to her brother, "Do you think the woods are haunted?" Jake shrugged, his eyes wide, the flicker of firelight reflecting off his anxious face. As the night deepened, an unsettling stillness blanketed the area. The gentle rustle of leaves turned into an unnerving silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Shadows twisted unnaturally, as if something were shifting just out of sight. Mark, feeling the weight of an unseen presence, looked into the trees. "It's just the wind," he reassured himself, though a deep-rooted fear began to gnaw at him. Suddenly, a sound pierced the air, an unfamiliar rustling that seemed to come from every direction. Mark's heart raced, and he glanced at Lisa, whose face had paled. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just a deer," he replied, but even he doubted it. The woods felt alive, breathing in unison with their fear. They huddled closer together, attempting to drown out the feeling of being watched. As darkness enveloped them, the fire flickered violently, and an eerie howl echoed through the trees. A chill crept down Mark's spine as he clutched the flashlight, the beam flickering as if reluctant to shine into the depths of the forest. Shadows danced just beyond the light, taunting them with the promise of something lurking within. With a deep breath, Mark tried to focus on the task at hand, fixing the tire and getting back on the road. But the weight of the forest pressed against them. He could sense that something was not right. They were far from the safety of civilization, surrounded by an ancient woods that seemed to harbor dark secrets. Little did they know that the forest was awakening, the air thickening with an ancient energy that whispered promises of horror. As the shadows deepened, the Johnsons were not just lost in the woods, they were beginning to lose themselves in the darkness that surrounded them. As the last vestiges of sunlight vanished, the forest transformed. The once vibrant colors of autumn dulled to a muted gray under the encroaching darkness, the air growing heavy with an oppressive stillness. The Johnson family huddled around the fire, its flames flickering against the night's chill, casting elongated shadows that danced among the trees like ghostly figures. With every crackle of the fire, the tension rose, the atmosphere thickening with unease. Mark and Lisa tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, cracking jokes to keep the kids entertained, but their laughter rang hollow in the night air. Mia and Jake exchanged nervous glances, their previous excitement waning, replaced by an instinctual awareness that something was wrong. As Mark fiddled with the tire iron, the sound of rustling leaves broke through their conversation, a soft, persistent sound that came from the depths of the woods. He paused, his heart racing, and turned toward the darkened tree line. "It's just the wind," he muttered, but doubt laced his words. The family fell silent, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, and Lisa's eyes darted toward the shadows. "Mark, it's not the wind, is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," he admitted, the word hanging in the air like a weight. The sounds morphed into low growls, a deep, unsettling noise that made the children shiver. Jake clutched Mia's arm, his grip tightening as fear etched itself across his small face. The fire crackled again, sending sparks into the air like tiny, desperate stars, but the warmth it provided felt feeble against the oppressive darkness. Mark forced a smile, trying to project confidence. "Let's not let a little noise scare us. Remember the stories we read about brave adventurers?" He looked at his children, hoping to instill some semblance of courage. But as the night wore on, the forest seemed to respond to their fear. Shadows shifted, whispering secrets that danced on the edge of perception. Each sound became magnified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. The atmosphere thickened, the very air around them pregnant with tension. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the woods, a sound so abrupt and violent that it sent the family into a frenzy. "What was that?" Lisa exclaimed, her voice cracking as she instinctively pulled the children close. "I don't know. Stay here," Mark shouted, his heart pounding as he glanced toward the darkened tree line. He grabbed the flashlight, the beam trembling as he directed it into the depths of the forest. But the light barely pierced the blackness, illuminating only a few feet ahead and revealing nothing but shadows that seemed to retreat at his approach. "What if it's a bear?" Jake whispered, his wide eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "It's probably just an animal," Mark replied, trying to reassure himself. "We're safe here." But the words felt inadequate against the gnawing fear gripping his heart. The laughter of the forest twisted into something malevolent, taunting them for their naivety. As if in response to their fear, a figure flickered at the edge of the beam, a pale silhouette among the trees, watching, waiting. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her features distorted, expression twisted in an eternal scream. Mark's breath hitched as he realized that she looked eerily familiar, like someone he had seen in a photograph long ago. "Dad!" Mia cried, pulling at his sleeve. "I don't like this. I want to go home." Mark's resolve crumbled at the sound of her voice, the desperation in her tone. "I know, sweetheart. We'll get through this," he said. But even he wasn't convinced. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the figure disappeared into the darkness. Panic surged within him, igniting his instincts. "We need to stay together," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear that clawed at his mind. They huddled closer, seeking warmth and comfort in each other's presence. Yet the shadows continued to encroach, creeping toward them like a tide of darkness. Then came the whispers, soft, chilling voices that drifted through the air, indistinct yet clearly intent. They felt like fingers brushing against their minds, planting seeds of dread. Lisa shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," Mark admitted, the hairs on his neck standing on end, "but it's just the wind." Before he could finish, the laughter erupted again, echoing through the trees. It was a chorus of haunting voices, mocking and sinister, resonating through the darkness. Mark's heart raced as he felt a primal urge to flee, but he fought against it, forcing himself to stay calm for the sake of his family. But as the night deepened, the woods came alive with sinister energy, an ancient presence awakening in response to their growing dread. The fire flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows that danced along the forest floor, mocking their fear. Each moment stretched, the oppressive atmosphere suffocating, pressing against their chests like a weight. And as the chilling laughter and whispers surrounded them, they realized that they were not just passing through an ordinary forest. Das Pontaneum. They were intruders in a realm that thrived on fear, and the night had only just begun. The shadows deepened, wrapping around the Johnson family like a shroud as night fully claimed the forest. The fire, once a comforting beacon, flickered weakly, its flames struggling against the encroaching darkness. The chilling laughter echoed through the trees, a cacophony of mocking voices that twisted the air around them. The family huddled together, the coldness seeping into their bones, pushing them closer as if trying to draw strength from one another. "Maybe we should go for help," Mia suggested, her voice quaking. The suggestion hung in the air like a dark omen, and Mark felt a wave of dread wash over him. The thought of leaving the relative safety of their fire-filled camp sent shivers down his spine. "No, we stick together," he insisted, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. But deep down, he knew they were far from safety. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on him, and he could sense the primal fear rising in the pit of his stomach. As they sat in silence, straining to hear over the disconcerting sounds of the night, a low growl reverberated through the trees. It was deep, throaty, and far too close for comfort. The growl sent chills racing up their spines, and the kids pressed against their parents, their wide eyes glistening with tears. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the forest. "I don't know," Mark replied, his heart racing as he stood, instinctively grabbing the flashlight. "I'll check it out." The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest just ahead, but the light seemed to waver, as if uncertain of what it should reveal. The moment the beam hit the trees, they appeared to twist and contort, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, yearning for him. A surge of panic washed over him. "Stay close," he called back to his family, though he felt like he was only trying to reassure himself. Mark stepped cautiously into the darkness, the ground beneath his feet crunching ominously. The air thickened with an unnatural weight, making every breath feel labored. With each step, the low growl morphed into a chorus of whispering voices, each word a dagger aimed at his sanity. "Turn back. You don't belong. We are waiting." Shaking off the haunting words, Mark forced himself to move forward. Then, in the dim light, he saw it, a shape darting between the trees. A flash of white. Was it an animal? He swung the flashlight, hoping to catch a glimpse, but all he saw were shadows retreating, laughter following in their wake, echoing like a taunt. "Mark!" Lisa's voice pulled him back, her tone frantic. He turned to find her standing by the fire, her eyes wide with fear, the children clinging to her sides. "Don't go too far." He hesitated, torn between the desire to investigate and the urgent need to protect his family. The woods pulsed with a life of their own, shadows moving just beyond the reach of their light. He returned to their camp, gripping the flashlight tightly, his knuckles white against the handle. As they settled back around the flickering fire, shadows seemed to crawl closer, pressing against the perimeter of their meager light. The whispers continued, swirling in the air like a sinister wind, and the forest felt alive with malicious intent. Mark's heart raced as he fought to hold on to his composure, but the anxiety gnawed at him relentlessly. "We can't stay here," he finally admitted, his voice thick with fear. "We need to find a way out." "But the car!" Jake cried, his small voice shaking. "What if we can't fix it?" "We'll figure something out," Mark said, but the confidence in his voice sounded hollow even to him. The knowledge that they were completely isolated clawed at him, a gnawing sensation that felt like cold fingers wrapping around his heart. Suddenly, Mia cried out, pointing toward the trees. "Look!" The beam of the flashlight caught a glimpse of a figure, a childlike shape standing just beyond the tree line. Pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow with a feral hunger. It vanished into the darkness, but not before a cold chill washed over them, wrapping them in an ice-cold grip of dread. "Stay close," Lisa urged, pulling the children protectively to her side. Mark could see her trembling, her own fears surfacing like bubbles breaking the surface of a deep, dark lake. The laughter from the shadows returned, a mocking symphony that echoed their fear. Mark's mind raced. They were not alone, Mom. The forest had awakened, revealing the lurking horrors that had laid dormant for centuries. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the trees themselves were urging them to leave or become part of the forest's dark legacy. Mark felt a surge of desperation. "But we need to stay alert," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "No matter what happens, we stick together. We can't let it get to us." But as the night deepened, he began to realize that the shadows were not just an external force, they were manifestations of their own deepest fears. The forest was alive, and it knew exactly how to exploit their vulnerabilities. Suddenly, the fire flared up violently, illuminating the forest in an intense glow for just a moment. In that brief flash, they saw the silhouettes of figures in the trees, moving in the darkness, eyes gleaming with malevolence. What are they?" Mia stammered, clinging to her mother. Mark's throat felt dry, a knot forming as he struggled to answer. "I don't know," he replied, voice hoarse, "but we can't let them in. We have to keep the fire alive." As the fire flickered, casting long shadows that twisted and morphed, they clung to each other, the oppressive darkness pressing in around them. They could feel the forest closing in, and as the whispers became a deafening chorus, they understood that the true nightmare was just beginning. With each passing moment, they could feel their grip on reality slipping away, the shadows shifting and swirling as they faced the chilling truth. Something ancient and malevolent was stalking them, eager to consume their fear and pull them into the darkness that had long claimed this forsaken place. As the night stretched on, time seemed to lose all meaning. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, each moment dragging longer than the last, every sound amplified into an ominous portent. The fire's flickering light battled against the encroaching darkness, but it felt increasingly fragile, as if it could be snuffed out with a mere breath. The shadows pulsed like a living entity, ebbing and flowing, whispering secrets only the forest understood. Mark clutched the flashlight with white-knuckled intensity, its beam trembling as he swept it across the trees. For every moment of reassurance, he felt another tendril of terror coil around his heart. The mocking laughter of unseen creatures echoed again, teasing him with the knowledge that they were being watched, hunted. "Mia, stay close to me," Lisa said, her voice trembling. Mia pressed her small body against her mother, eyes wide with fear. Jake clutched his sister's hand tightly, the warmth of her presence a fragile comfort in the sea of terror surrounding them. "Maybe if we yell for help, someone will hear us," Jake suggested, but his voice was shaky and even he didn't sound convinced. "No," Mark interjected sharply. "If we scream, we'll only draw their attention. We need to stay quiet and keep the fire going." He glanced at the flames, which had diminished to a few wavering embers. The knowledge that they might be cut off from the world felt like a noose tightening around his throat. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, mixing with the tang of fear that hung in the air. As they settled into a tense silence, Mark could hear the scuttling of something small in the underbrush, scratching against bark and rustling leaves. The sound was unnerving, like a warning bell tolling their doom. Then came the first real sign of their pursuers. A rustling sound emanated from the darkness behind them, followed by a soft thud, something heavy hitting the ground. Mark whipped around, shining the flashlight into the blackness. For a moment, the beam caught something, a glimpse of a figure, tall and gaunt, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the light. Its features were indistinguishable, but Mark could feel its gaze boring into him, a hungry stare that chilled him to the bone. "Did you see that?" he gasped, heart racing. "What was it?" Lisa whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know, but it's not alone," Mark said, his throat dry as he scanned the trees, searching for any movement in the dark. The laughter crescendoed, and shadows danced mockingly just beyond the firelight. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying a new sound, a low, keening wail that spiraled through the trees, filling the air with sorrow and anguish. It was a sound that spoke of despair, pulling at the strings of their hearts, evoking emotions they couldn't quite comprehend. "Make it stop," Mia cried, covering her ears. "I don't like it." Mark's chest tightened. "It's just a trick," he said, but his voice was strained. "They're trying to scare us." With renewed urgency, he began to gather branches, trying to feed the dying fire. "We need to keep the light alive," he shouted over the din, tossing the sticks into the flames. Lisa joined him, her hands shaking as she searched for more wood, but the forest around them seemed to offer nothing, only shadows and whispers. As the fire roared back to life, illuminating their faces with an eerie glow, the oppressive darkness around them shifted, drawing closer, as if in response to their defiance. The wailing intensified, morphing into a cacophony of tortured screams, shrieks that echoed with memories of loss and anguish. Mark felt an icy grip on his heart as dread settled in his stomach, the realization dawning that whatever lurked in the shadows fed on fear and pain, thriving on their despair. Then a blood-curdling scream erupted from the trees, human and filled with terror. It echoed through the forest, freezing Mark in place. Lisa gasped, clutching the children tightly. "What was that?" she whispered, eyes wide with horror. "I don't know," he said, a sinking feeling overwhelming him. "But we have to go, now." As they prepared to abandon their camp, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The forest shook with a primal energy, branches snapping under unseen weight. Shadows flickered wildly, and from the darkness, the figures emerged, twisted shapes that slithered and prowled, their intentions clear. "Run!" Mark shouted, adrenaline surging as he turned toward the road where their car lay stranded, the flashlight beam casting frantic light into the trees. The family broke from their makeshift camp, sprinting toward the vehicle, but the forest felt alive, branches reaching out like skeletal hands tangling in their hair and clothes. Behind them, the laughter erupted anew, louder, more frenzied, the air thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. They could hear the sounds of pursuit, footsteps crashing through the underbrush, the whispers morphing into shrieks of excitement as the shadows chased them. "Faster! Don't look back!" Mark urged, pushing his family forward. He could feel their fear in the air, a tangible force that threatened to drag them down. They raced through the dark, the flashlight flickering like a dying star, revealing fleeting glimpses of the horrors pursuing them. Just ahead, the outline of their car loomed like a beacon of hope in the oppressive night. Mark fumbled for the keys, hands trembling, heart pounding. "Get in the car! Now!" he shouted. They stumbled into the vehicle, panic fueling their movements. Jake scrambled into the back seat and Lisa rushed to secure Mia, both of them sobbing in fear. Mark wrestled with the ignition, his hands slick with sweat. As the engine roared to life, the shadows converged around them, swirling like a tempest. The trees seemed to bend, grotesquely twisting toward the vehicle, blocking their escape. The air thickened with an otherworldly chill, and the shadows whispered promises of despair and doom, their laughter wrapping around the car like chains. "Go, go!" Lisa screamed, and Mark slammed the gas pedal down. The tires screeched against the gravel, kicking up stones as they shot forward, the darkness closing in behind them. As they barreled down the road, the echoes of laughter and whispers faded. But a sickening realization settled over them. The forest had marked them, and the nightmare was far from over. The forest seemed to exhale as the Johnson family sped away from the haunted woods, the trees receding into the rear-view mirror like twisted silhouettes in a waking nightmare. Mark's heart raced, pounding against his ribs, as he fought to maintain control of the vehicle. The tires hummed a frantic rhythm against the asphalt, but even as they distanced themselves from the malevolence that lurked behind, an unsettling dread gnawed at their minds. "Are we safe now?" Mia whispered, her voice small and tremulous from the back seat. Mark glanced at her in the mirror, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights, and felt a pang of guilt wash over him. They had been so close to freedom, yet now doubt flickered in the corners of his mind. "I don't know, honey," he admitted, his voice taut, "but we'll be okay." He tried to reassure himself more than her, clenching the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline. Lisa sat beside him, her eyes darting nervously to the darkened windows, every flicker of movement outside causing her to flinch. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, a harsh cough breaking the tense silence. Mark's stomach dropped as the vehicle began to slow, the headlights dimming. "No, no, no," he muttered, panic flooding his veins. "Dad!" Jake cried, gripping the back of Mark's seat. "What's happening?" "I'm trying to fix it," Mark snapped, but the car jerked violently, sputtering to a halt on the side of the road. The headlights flickered out, plunging them into darkness. "Why did it stop?" Mia whimpered, her small voice filled with fear. "I don't know," Mark replied, his pulse racing. "Stay close, everyone. Let me see what's wrong." As he opened the door and stepped away into the night, a chill raced down his spine, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The familiar sounds of the forest felt alien now, too quiet, too still. He leaned against the hood, pulling out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the pitch blackness. With each step, the oppressive weight of the forest settled around him again, the shadows creeping closer, curling around the edges of his vision. He peered beneath the vehicle, but there was nothing visibly wrong. "It's just the battery," he muttered, trying to reassure himself. "I can fix it." But as he moved around the car, the shadows flickered in the corner of his eye, pulling his attention away from the task at hand. He glanced toward the woods, where dark shapes writhed among the trees, silhouettes twisted in ways that defied logic. The laughter returned, echoing like a sinister lullaby, coaxing him to turn back, to succumb to the despair waiting just beyond the light. "Mark!" Lisa's voice snapped him back to reality, the urgency in her tone cutting through the fog of fear. "Hurry!" He rushed back to the car, heart pounding. "What is it?" "Something's out there," she whispered, eyes wide, pointing to the tree line. The children huddled together, their faces pale with terror. The forest seemed to shift, a presence looming just beyond their reach. As Mark climbed into the driver's seat, the air grew colder, the darkness thickening like a living thing. The sound of rustling leaves surrounded them, and he could almost feel the gaze of unseen eyes watching, waiting. "Let's try the lights again," he said, fumbling for the ignition, dread pooling in his gut. He turned the key, but the engine only sputtered weakly, refusing to start. Panic gripped him as he slammed his palm against the steering wheel, a primal scream of frustration escaping his lips. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a tempest. "They're coming," Lisa murmured, clutching Mia's hand tightly. In a last-ditch effort, Mark shifted into neutral and pushed the vehicle, hoping to gain momentum to restart it. He felt the weight of his family's fear pressing on him as they all joined in, pushing with everything they had, hearts racing, terror coursing through their veins. But then it happened. The laughter escalated into a howling cacophony, the shadows surging forward, coalescing into grotesque shapes. Faces formed within the darkness, twisted with malice, mocking their desperate attempt to escape. "You will not leave," they seemed to chant, a chorus of dread that echoed around them. "Get in!" Mark shouted, scrambling back into the car as he slammed the door shut, heart pounding. "We need to lock the doors." He fumbled to engage the locks, sweat pouring down his brow as the shadows pressed in, the laughter transforming into a symphony of rage. "Mark!" Lisa screamed, pointing out the window. Just beyond the edge of their headlights, a figure emerged, a tall, skeletal shape with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light, its mouth stretched into a horrific grin. The air in the car thickened, a tangible dread settling around them. "Start, damn it!" Mark cried, jamming the key into the ignition again. With a jolt, the engine roared to life, a deafening sound in the suffocating silence. The headlights flaring back to life, illuminating the chaos beyond. The figures recoiled, their forms twisting back into the shadows. But the laughter persisted, echoing in their ears. "Go, go!" Mark shouted, slamming the car into gear and racing down the road, the tires screeching against the pavement. But as they sped away, the darkness followed. A palpable entity that chased them with relentless fury. The trees blurred by in a terrifying rush, shadows morphing into grotesque shapes, each a reminder of the horrors they had narrowly escaped. Suddenly, the road ahead twisted into a fork. Mark's heart raced as he realized he had to choose a direction, a choice that could lead them to safety or deeper into the nightmare. Panic surged through him as he glanced at Lisa and the kids, their faces pale and stricken with fear. "Right!" Lisa yelled, pointing instinctively. Without hesitating, Mark turned the wheel, barreling down the path. The laughter rose to a fever pitch, a howling chorus of desperation that filled the air, drowning out everything else. They hurtled down the road, the forest closing in around them, branches clawing at the sides of the car. "Faster!" Jake shouted, his small voice shaking with terror. "I'm trying," Mark replied, feeling the weight of his family's fear pressing down on him. The headlights illuminated the trees, but the darkness seemed to bleed into the light, consuming everything in its path. The laughter echoed in his ears, an ever-present reminder that the forest had no intention of letting them go. As they rounded a sharp curve, the road ahead seemed to shift, twisting unnaturally. Mark fought to maintain control, the car skidding slightly as he pressed the accelerator. "Hold on!" he yelled, gripping the wheel tightly as the shadows lurked at the edges of his vision. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shuddered, a violent tremor that rattled the car. Mark's heart dropped as the headlights flickered ominously. The laughter reached a crescendo, a chaotic symphony of madness that threatened to engulf them. "It's going to get us!" Mia sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mark pushed down harder on the accelerator, but the shadows seemed to claw at the tires, pulling them back. "Not today! Today!" he roared, determination surging within him. "We will not be taken." With every ounce of strength, he fought against the grip of the darkness, willing the car forward. The forest shrieked in response, the laughter morphing into a blood-curdling wail. They burst through the tree line, the world opening up into an expanse of moonlight and stars. As they emerged from the suffocating grip of the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Mark slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a skidding halt. They were free, at least for now. Panting, Mark turned to his family, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We made it," he breathed, tears of relief streaming down his face. But just as hope began to flicker within him, he noticed the darkness creeping back toward them, tendrils of shadow stretching out as if to reclaim what they had lost. The laughter resumed, softer now but no less menacing, the promise of nightmares lingering in the air. Mark's heart sank. The forest was still there, just beyond the light, waiting for the next opportunity to ensnare them in its malevolence. "Let's go," he said, voice trembling, knowing that while they had escaped this time, the nightmare was far from over. The night stretched on, an unending tapestry of terror, and as they drove into the unknown, he understood that some horrors never truly leave you. They merely lie in wait, biding their time until the next unsuspecting soul dares to enter their domain.